The final category of sample-based instruments we're going to be looking at in this section are actually not instruments at all. They don't generate any sound by default. They have to be populated with other instruments in order to be played back. And these are what are commonly referred to as drum machines. So we can tell that if I'm hitting different cells here, we're not hearing anything, and that's because we need to either bring on samples or bring on instruments. This particular sampler inside of Bitwig may be unique as compared to what you're working with in terms of what's your drum machine, because we can bring on anything we want to bring on here. I could bring on a sample, I could bring on a subtractive synthesizer, I could actually layer the two using some kind of an instrument layer. So anything is fair game here, but we're going to be focusing specifically to just samples, keeping this very simple so that you can understand the benefits of working with a drum machine as compared to just creating like a multi-sampled instrument. What's the point of working with the drum machine? So let's go and grab a couple of different samples here. Bring that on to D1, and then we're going to grab a kick. That sounds pretty cool, so we'll bring that on to C1. Now you might be wondering right off the bat, why are you not key tracking this? And this also goes to show and explains why key tracking is not turned on by default, because I've dragged this kick drum onto a C1. So when I hit C1, I'm going to hear it, and I'm going to hear it in its default raw state, right? Just a little bit quieter. If I turn key tracking on, that is not going to be the case unless I drag this to a C3, or I come down here and I drag it to a C1. And the only instance when you would turn key tracking on is if for some reason you were going to be duplicating this sampler up. Okay, so if we had a piano sample and we wanted to still basically play it like a piano, because right now I could go up like, and this is key tracking appropriately where this is going up a step, this is going up another step here on D1, and then also on E1, right? You can hear that. You can hear how the pitch is rising. But the only time I'd ever want to do that is if I needed to affect these guys differently, or if, for example, I needed to play in a really fast, like, type hi-hat pattern or like a snare roll. That may make sense, but I probably wouldn't actually want the pitch to go up, in which case I would just be turning this off, and then I could at least get the same exact sound. But we'll come back to that a little bit more, especially with the effects processing. But that's why, by default, this sampler is not turned on, and if you needed to change the pitch, you would just change the pitch from down here. But I kind of like the way this pitch sounds just at its regular spot. All right, so we have another issue, and that's that the snare is not sustaining out for its full length. But that can be easily solved and fixed. Another thing you commonly find inside of drum machines is the ability to cut off or choke one sample by another sample. So if I want this snare cutting out of the way every time the kick hits, I don't need to do any elaborate kind of sidechain compression. I can just easily go in here and choose choked by the kick. So when the snare hits and then the kick comes in, the kick will cut off the snare. So, and you see it goes red there every time the kick is hitting. All right, so something very straightforward and simple. I just figured I would show you that and set it up quickly. Now, we are not really going to be talking about effects processing in terms of how do you want to affect your kick or how do you want to affect your snare. I just want to show you the benefit of working with the drum machine as compared to working with individual samplers or creating like a multi-sample to be your drum kit. If we use just a single sampler and we had a multi-sample in here, we would only have one choice for our effect processing, and that would be to effect process every single sample in that sampler. For example, I turn on the distortion. The distortion is to the right of this drum machine. It is going to affect everything inside of it. And let's make this a little bit more beefy. So we can hear how it affects the snare and how it's affecting the kick. What if I say, all right, let's turn a chorus on as well? Well, I might only want this chorus to be on the snare. I don't want it to be on the kick. It's sounding really bizarre, right? That's probably not something that you'd want on your kick drum. It's not going to stabilize it. But I want it on the snare drum. Is it possible for me to do that? In this setup, it absolutely is possible for me to do that. And all I have to do is select the snare, drag the chorus, bring it on. Okay? And now we can see we have 2 dots down here as compared to just the 1 dot here. All we have inside of the kick is the sampler. Inside of the snare, we have the sampler and we have the chorus. It also might make sense to turn this down. Well, how can I turn that down? Where can I control that from? I can actually control it from right in here. I have different mixing settings here. I basically have another channel strip for each of these cells I select. So if I want to turn the snare down, I can do it from here and I leave the kick alone. We also have another display that will probably make this easier for you to see and understand. Right now we're looking at the drum machine, which has the drum machine followed by the distortion, right? This is our classic signal flow left to right. But when I open this up, we can now see that we have the kick, which is just the sampler, and then the snare, which gives us the sampler and the chorus. All right? So this is the power of the drum machine. And if we want to take this one step further, we absolutely could. And to take this one step further, what I would be doing is I would take this distortion and I would put it in the effects slot right here. All right. And the reason for doing that, and you see that now it's not showing us the distortion. We actually have to be on the drum machine and opening this up. But the reason why I would go and do something like that is if I was setting up macro controls from the top level. And with the drum machine, I could set up macro controls at every level if I wanted to. For example, if I wanted to control the mix amount on this chain, right, I could go in here and I could set that up with a macro. But I'd prefer to not have to be opening a bunch of things up. I want it all inside of the drum machine. And as long as things are inside of the drum machine, like this distortion is still affecting both parts. It's just sitting in the instrument as compared to outside of it. I can take this and I can adjust, say, the mix and also the drive. Okay, so we could write here dist mix, and drive we can just leave alone. All right. But I could also control the amount of chorus onto the snare from the top level. That's what makes this really the reason why I would put the distortion in here. All right, so now I can close everything down except for just seeing the sampler instrument, or excuse me, seeing just the drum machine. And I could then go in I have all of the controls right there. Your digital audio workstation or the sampler you're working with may not have a setup like this, which is fine. You could always bring this to the outside. But as you see, by doing that, it no longer falls within the bounds of this instrument. And so setting up that macro isn't going to work. And in fact, it looks like I'd actually have to redo the whole thing by dragging it out and bringing it back in, which is fine. This is just an example. But I wanted to show you where and when the drum machine makes sense. Very rarely would it make sense to use, or should I say, going for realism with the drum machine? And I say realism when I'm talking about acoustic instruments like a piano, for example. Would it make sense for me to bring in here a sample at C1, a sample at C#1, at D1, at D#1? Typically, no, if you're going for realism. You're just going to stick to your multi-sampled instrument. But if for some reason you wanted to process each of those notes differently with different effects, that might be one instance where you would do it. And so you would still have all of these individual chains that you could then add effects to and get crazy with note by note by note. So that's one example of a drum machine. In the next video, we'll look at Native Instruments Battery, which is a little bit more classic and gives you a lot of power from cell to cell that at the same time is identical. All right, look forward to that one.